Hello and welcome to today's episode of A Slice of Medieval. Now, there's this saying, woe to the country whose king is a child. Why is it a problem that the king is a child? So we decided we would focus on one person. And of course, given Derek's penchant for the Wars of the Roses and the fact that I've just been writing about Edward IV, we thought we'd focus on Edward V. Especially seeing as also it seems to have been a really big deal that Edward V was only a child in 1483 when his dad died. So let's have a look at why Edward V didn't actually get to rule. So I suppose the first thing is, who was Edward V?
So Edward V was the eldest son of Edward IV. They weren't very imaginative with their names, really. And his mother was Elizabeth Woodville, who's got a bit of a reputation of her own for one reason or another. For most people who haven't delved into this particularly, they'll know him as the elder of the two princes in the tower, which is a phrase that I absolutely abhor and is just a nonsense phrase, really, to identify these two boys. So we're stuck with it, but I don't like it much. And if anybody has any image of Edward V, because obviously there are no extant paintings or images from 1483. If anyone has any image of him in their head, it's more than likely the painting by Victorian artist John Everett Millais, who did a picture of an imagination of the two brothers, Edward V and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, as boys, and he portrays them as these innocent, vulnerable children, and probably has done more than anybody else to muddy the waters about Edward V, because it's an evisceration of the real Edward V. But it's everywhere. Wherever you look online, in books, you will find that Edward V is portrayed by this one image.
Yeah, blonde-haired, blue-eyed boys in blue, dark blue velvet suits, looking with that afraid look on their faces, looking into the distance.
Yeah. A travesty, an absolute travesty of what the lad was like.
It's those Victorians again, though, isn't it?
Let's not get started on the Victorians again, otherwise we won't have a podcast about Edward V.
By the time he was born, he was literally the much desired heir, wasn't he? Because Edward IV had been on the throne since 1461. He'd married Elizabeth Woodville in 1464. And then for the next 5 years, they had a succession. She was pregnant most of the time, but it was to a succession of daughters. And Edward lost the throne in 1470 due to the machinations of the Earl of Warwick and was basically chased out of the country, leaving the pregnant Elizabeth Woodville to seek sanctuary in Westminster Abbey. And Edward V was born at what must have been the lowest part of his father's reign.
Yeah.
You know, his father's lost the throne. His mum's in sanctuary in Westminster Abbey, only attended by her mother, her daughters, and forced to give birth to Edward IV's son and heir in what must have been dire circumstances for her.
I think December 1470 was when he was actually born, but that particular story on its own could have ended very differently. It wouldn't have been uncommon for a woman to die in childbirth, particularly in the stressful situation that she was in. So, you know, I mean, the fact that he was born at all is a bit of a miracle, really, given the circumstances surrounding his mother at the time. And of course, Edward IV didn't see him for some time.
Yeah. And he wouldn't have known for a while that he even had a son, would he? It wouldn't have been,
Probably not, no,
with him
no.
being born in December, travel across the channel in deepest winter is not easy. So it might have taken him a couple of months before he found out he was even the father to a son.
Yes, I mean, having said that, he would have known that she was pregnant. So
Mm,
what he wouldn't have known was the outcome. Was it another daughter?
no,
Got plenty of those already. Um,
or even whether Elizabeth had
yeah,
survived.
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Luckily, she did. And that was one of the things as well. The idea that he didn't have his own son and heir in 1470 was one of the contributing factors to him being chased from England, wasn't it? Because his heir at the time was George, Duke of Clarence, who thought he might actually have a chance for the throne.
In 1469, Warwick is actively trying to replace Edward with Clarence, but that all ends in disaster. And my view is that most people, when they got to know Clarence, liked him less and less and less. And I think Warwick thought he was a really good idea until he got to know
Mm,
him a bit better. But Clarence was married to his daughter Isabel, his elder daughter. So there was a family link there as well. And it was obviously advantageous to Warwick to press the claim of Clarence. And as you say, at that point, Edward IV didn't have a son, and Clarence was actually the heir presumptive anyway. But in 1470, Clarence is really out of the picture. In fact, he's a sort of spare thumb because Warwick has done a deal with Margaret of Anjou to bring back, or at least to reinstate Henry VI, who does have a son, Prince Edward, another Edward, just to confuse things. So in 1470, yes, you're absolutely right that the king who is put back on the throne, Henry VI, somewhat bewildered Henry VI, does have a son and heir. He's about 17. So, that's a viable succession there and then. Edward IV has to flee because he's outmaneuvered. And to be fair, his rule during the 1460s is
mm.
not exactly perfect. He hasn't really achieved a great deal. So, and he's the new kid. He's just arrived, really, in royal terms.
And Edward the Fourth's still only in his late 20s, isn't he, by this point as well?
Yeah, I think he was about 19 when he became king, wasn't he? 19.
Yeah.
Yeah, he is still very young. It's difficult with this period to make judgments without hindsight, without looking at what happened afterwards.
Mm,
But at the time in 1470, I think the average sort of politician, nobleman, man in the street would have assumed that Henry VI was now going to stay king till he died, and his son, the Prince of Wales, was then going to become king.
mm,
I don't think anybody really believed that Edward IV would be back.
mm.
We know he did come back, but if you think about it at the time, people wouldn't have thought that. How on earth would he be able to come back?
Yeah.
It's unthinkable. And really, the only reason why he was able to was that Queen Margaret, distrusted Warwick so much that she delayed coming back to England with the Prince of Wales. Had she arrived sooner, I think that regime would have been solidified. And I really can't see any way that Edward could have got back in. But he kind of slipped in at a moment where Warwick's coalition of people who didn't necessarily get on was at a weak point. The birth of Edward V, or the future Edward V, was a key moment, obviously, and it gave Edward IV that male heir that he needed. And a
Mm,
few years later, he managed to get a spare as well. So
yeah. When you look at Henry VIII and his search for a male heir and how his sense of urgency over it, you don't get that with Edward the Fourth.
he was, as you say, still pretty young. And there's not going to be a sense of urgency about whether you've got an heir if you haven't actually got the throne.
No, that's
I
true.
think I think the important thing for him was to see what he could achieve. I mean, whether he could actually get the throne back was the first thing.
Mm.
Then, if she'd given birth to a son, all well and good. But I don't think that was the top of his agenda at that point. Yeah, but anyway, she does give birth to a son, and that son becomes Edward V.
Yeah, and he is one of the heirs to the throne that we know most about education wise, don't we? There were these ordinances set up to govern every aspect of his childhood to make sure that they raised the perfect prince, sort of thing, the
Yeah,
perfect king. This was at the height of the Renaissance. The idea of learning wasn't something that was spat on or just for clerics in those days. It was like, a prince has to be learned. And Henry VIII and Prince Arthur would go on to benefit from that as well. But the first one that we see really who's educated like that is Edward V.
yeah, it's totally original, really. I mean, there are some noble children were raised in a kind of similar way. There were sort of pointers to it, but the household of Edward V was very different from previous heirs to the throne. As Prince of Wales, I mean, he had a governor appointed. That's a new term as well. That was Anthony Woodville Earl Rivers. A brilliant appointment, really, despite what has been said by some because his name ends in Woodville. Um, he was an excellent choice, highly educated, a capable soldier, firmly loyal to Edward IV. I mean, who else would you choose to educate a young man at that time? So
Mm,
yes, you're right. He had a setup that was new, it was different, and it was designed to raise the perfect prince. And the ordinances are interesting. They were first published in 1473 when, as we know, Edward was not yet three, and they covered absolutely everything. His day was regulated to the hour, and he's only small at that point. That
yeah.
must have been a bit bewildering, I would think, but he would have got used to that framework of the day. And I want to come back to that a bit later, the ordinances, because they change, and I want to talk about that
Mm,
a bit later. But that his education was sort of second to none, really. He had his household included, I think, the Bishop of Rochester, John Alcock, and he was his kind of spiritual
yeah.
guide. He also had his half brother there, uh, Richard Grey, and he had a chamberlain. People often misunderstand this term chamberlain. It's used a lot, and lots of people haven't a clue what a chamberlain does. But quite literally, he manages the chamber. That's to say,
Mm.
the main sort of reception room for a particular person of importance. So Edward IV's chamberlain was William Hastings, and the Chamberlain for Edward V was a sort of not terribly young, not terribly young Yorkist retainer who'd been faithful to Edward IV for a long time. And that was Sir Thomas Vaughan. So around the young prince, there were these figures, and they were constants. Those people were
Mm.
there throughout until 1483. So, it was a very settled environment.
But a lot of the Woodville detractors claim that, it was all Woodvilles who were around him and it's Elizabeth Woodville appointed everybody. But there was actually the appointments were made by a council that had actually been established
Yes.
to decide on what was best for the prince. And that council, yes, it included Elizabeth Woodville, but it also included Clarence and the Dukes of Clarence and Gloucester, didn't it? The king's brothers. So they weren't
Yeah.
actually kept out of Edward V's education.
Yeah, I think again, it's all hindsight. It's all looking at what happened later, and it's also looking for justifications that in some way Edward V was a pawn of his mother and
Mm.
uncles and half brothers. But I mean, it's all after the event. It's at the time. I don't think Richard of Gloucester or anybody else was saying, "Oh, this is
Mm.
terrible." Aside from the fact there is, folks, zero evidence that the Duke of Gloucester did not get on with Earl Rivers. There's no evidence at all. So why would Gloucester think
Yeah.
Rivers was a poor choice as governor? Well,
Mm.
he wouldn't. And not that he was bothered anyway, because Gloucester's sphere of influence was in the north. His brother's death was a
Mm.
long way off as far as he and everybody else were concerned. When in 1473 and in the 1470s, the idea that Edward IV was going to die soon probably never crossed anybody's mind, really, not practically.
No, exactly. And as we in our episode we recorded with Danny Burton, the biographer of Anthony Woodville, when you look into who he was and
Yeah.
what he was the ideal choice. He was the William Marshall of his age. He was the perfect person to teach Edward everything he needed to know. And he wouldn't have been teaching Edward this idea that Edward was a Woodville pawn. He would have been teaching him about his forebears, the Plantagenet kings, not the Woodvilles. This boy was going to be a king of England. You instill in him Henry V and Edward III. And
Yeah, I think a lot has been written and spoken about his education, and I think it is important. But for me, the most important single characteristic is the young king's personality,
mm,
because Henry VI was the son of Henry V. It didn't make
yeah,
him a great general, a
no.
great king, or anything else. He just wasn't up to it. His personality was not suited for a king. Edward V is a whole different ball game altogether. And we could spend a few minutes talking about that, because for me, the ordinances for his household and his upbringing show us that this was a lad who had a mind of his own. This was a lad who was definitely the son of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, both strong personalities. And how do we know that? Well, we know that because the ordinances of 1473 were reissued shortly before Edward IV's death, not far before. And what they show is a complete tightening up of access to the young boy, of what he's allowed to do, of what his servants are allowed to talk to him about. And if you read between the lines, it's not difficult to see that he has been bucking the system. He has been getting around. I mean, for example, one of the new ordinances said that he can't give any orders without the permission of his governor or chamberlain, and or his brother, half brother Richard Grey. And the reason is because if you're the Prince of Wales in your own household, you can say to your servants, "Well,
Yeah,
do
I'm the
this,
Prince of Wales. You have
do
to
that."
listen to me.
I'm the Prince of Wales. What are you going to do? Not do it? So the new ordinances specifically state, and they tell the servants, just because he says you're supposed to do something, don't do
He's
it.
still a
Not
child.
without coming to us first. Yeah. And, I mean, who knew a 12-year-old boy bucking the system? I mean, totally unusual. Never heard of it
Yeah.
before. And these, for me, these new ordinances read like you'd be telling your 12-year-old child that they were grounded
Mm,
because had far too much license. And so what that tells me is the young Edward V, had a strong personality, and he was not going to be pushed about if he could avoid it. And he was going to get up to no good if he could as
mm,
well. Now, compare that to a 12-year-old Henry VI. We're
mm,
talking about a completely different order of personality. So for me, and I do think that his personality is absolutely crucial, this is not a child who is going to be bossed about. When he becomes king, he will be king. He he
yeah.
will he will use his brain and his personality to rule. He's not
Mm.
going to be someone who can be a puppet king, a puppet king.
He was probably already telling everybody in his household exactly that.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think the thing that gets me is you have this idea. I mean, I do remember when I was reading about Prince Arthur one day and they said, oh, he was established in his own household at Ludlow because that's what they did with heirs to the throne. And I was there thinking, well, they did with the last heir to the throne, Edward the Fifth, but before that, they didn't because it was actually a Yorkist
Yeah.
thing rather than Edward the Fourth was raised at Ludlow, but he wasn't destined to be king
No,
at that point.
exactly. Yeah.
So I always find it interesting when you see where they say, oh, because that's how it was done. And it's like, well, it was done in the House of York that way, which is why Edward the Fifth was established at
And
Ludlow.
I think Edward the Fourth thought, well, worked for me, so let's do it with our son. And I think it was quite sensible.
Yeah, traditionally, the royal nursery was at
Yeah,
Windsor. You know, the children were sent to Windsor, close enough to London to be able for the king and queen to be able to visit, but away and in this massive fortress for safety. And that's where Edward the Black Prince was raised, and all the heirs before
yeah.
him. So Ludlow was definitely a very new experience for the son and heir of the king.
I think there was also probably some value in keeping the heir away from court, away from
Mm.
influences which might not be very favourable, which might be unsettling or dangerous.
But Ludlow was the heartlands of the Yorkists, because they were also the Mortimer
Yes,
family, and the Mortimers were martial
yeah.
lords, so they had the a longer affiliation from Ludlow and that
If you're
area.
Edward the Fourth, you would think the safest place in England to put your son was Ludlow. You would just think that
Mm,
it was a very safe place to keep him. Of course, that it kind of backfires in lots of ways later on. But again,
mm.
you can't use hindsight because the fact that it backfired later for a whole load of accidental occurrences isn't a reason to say it was a bad idea to start with. Um,
No,
Nobody could have foreseen what happened in 1483. Well, I'll go further. Nobody did foresee what happened in
mm.
1483. Nobody, including Richard of Gloucester.
Yeah, and the idea of Ludlow was it was safe, it was in the Yorkist heartlands, he could be raised in security, but allowed to stretch his wings as he got older. And of course, as Prince of Wales, he could exert his authority on
Yeah,
Wales when he grew older and actually learn the art of ruling, which is what Henry IV did with his son, Henry
yeah,
V. He was sent to Wales to rule before he became King of
yeah,
England. So and of course Edward IV had happy memories of his childhood there with
yeah,
his brother.
yeah.
That was the plan, but as you say, 1483, you just don't really, nobody could have foreseen it. So, but his education, he was taught a wide range of things, wasn't he? He would
Yeah.
have been taught to read and write. Wasn't it that he had mornings were lessons in the classroom and afternoons lessons with the sword and things like that? Did they?
In the early years, he's not going to be taught to use a sword because he's only about 4 or 5. So, I mean, I think the activities would have changed as the prince got older.
Mm,
A constant would have been the spiritual content of his day. That would have been an absolute constant
yes.
throughout because, it was part of being a prince, part of being king was your spiritual role because you are going to be anointed by God as king. So
Mm,
it's all the spiritual side is all part of your understanding of your place in the world. So that would have been constant. But I think as he got older, he would have done more sort of physical workouts and what people tend to think of all these military training as being sort of sword fighting, but a lot of it was hand to hand combat. That was one of the first things that anybody learned. As he gets older,
yeah.
he's going to be doing more and more, shall we say, skill training. He's
Mm,
also very well read, uh, as far as we can tell, and I think it's important to punctuate this by saying that the number of times young Edward is mentioned in the first 12 years of his life is very, very few indeed. I
mm,
mean, he's hardly scratching the page of history in those early years. It's only when we get to 1483, suddenly there's a lot about Edward V. But that's why it's so difficult.
Yeah, well, we have that with all royal children. I mean, the
Yeah,
number of times I write, we don't know when they were born, or we know very little about their childhood, but they would have had, we know that they would have had governors, they would have been had lessons, they would have been taught diplomacy, because that was going to be a big part of his life, actually
yeah,
interacting with other kings. So he would have had to have learnt about the history of Europe, the diplomacy of Europe, whose side you were on and whose
yeah.
side you were going to be not on. The relationship with France is would have
Mm,
taken a few years to
yeah,
learn. And also
yeah.
languages. We know most royal children were taught Latin for starters, so they could follow the officers of the day. Most of them, they would have learnt French, they would have learnt Latin. I mean, there are some of them, some of the daughters you read, they had three or four languages.
Mm.
So you can't imagine that the princes were given any fewer
Well,
languages.
except I think, the daughters, that's what the daughters did. They were
Yes.
being bred to be wives and mothers,
Mm,
and they would have accomplishments, and that I think is a constant. But for the young men, they were expected to do other things and be good at other things. I think he would
mm,
also be Rivers was a very intelligent man, and I can imagine conversations with Prince Edward and him where Edward's saying, "Well, tell me about Thomas Stanley. Who's he? What
yes.
those kind of things. They must have talked about other people.
Oh,
What
yeah,
about my Uncle
definitely.
Gloucester?
Yeah.
And I think he would have picked things up
Mm,
from Rivers particularly, but others, Thomas Vaughan and his half brother. He would have picked up
mm.
a lot of some useful information, some gossip, no doubt.
And also things like battle
Yeah,
tactics, he would have read, I mean, I seem to remember Caesar was a big one to
yeah.
study. And of course, in 1470s, you could look back on the battles, recent battles, and say, right, how would you have done better? How would you have done that different if you'd been in command?
I don't know. I think that might have been a bit raw. Not sure they did that.
All right, Agincourt
Yeah, I
instead
think
then.
they
Go
might
back
have
to
looked back a
Agincourt
bit
and
further.
Crécy and Poitiers.
Yeah.
But studying the battles of the past to learn how to be a good general,
Yes.
because the problem with peacetime is you can't actually act as a general to work out what works and what doesn't work. So
Yeah.
you have to do it from example.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot said about the fact that he was isolated in Ludlow. And I think there's some truth in that, but it's a kind of deliberate isolation rather than an accidental one. And he would have been at all the main family occasions, weddings, funerals, and so on. So if you're his uncle Gloucester, Richard of Gloucester, those are the times when you'd actually have seen him.
Mm,
But Richard was not a great conversationalist at the best of times, I don't think. And how many times, if you go to a family wedding or funeral, how many times do you strike up a conversation with the nephew or a second cousin or whatever?
mm,
You don't generally do that unless you happen to be side by side with them, confronted with them, and say, "Oh, hello, how are you doing?" sort of thing. So
mm,
a
yeah.
lot of rubbish is talked about how Richard have no idea about his nephews, alienated from him, and so on and so forth. Um, it's just how life was at that time.
Mm. Well, he would have visited, like you say, Edward would have visited court. He would have had frequently, I'm sure with the permission of the Crown, been visited at Ludlow. All
Yeah,
the main lords would have sought a reason to go and visit the
yeah,
prince at some point because their future depended on being on his good side.
yeah, yeah.
So, they want to be remembered. Take him a little gift, call in on your way. If you're heading up north or you're heading down south, stopping at Ludlow on the way and pay your respects.
I think there would have been less of that though, because of his young age and because of the fact that
Mm,
nobody expected Edward IV to die when he did. So I think
mm,
if he'd been sort of 14, 15, there would have been a lot more jockeying for position, shall we say. But I don't
mm,
think there was too much of that simply because nobody was expecting the king to die suddenly,
Yeah.
so it rather affected it.
We do have instances of him
Yes,
attending court. In 1481, he was with his dad, Edward IV, at Sandwich,
yeah,
reviewing the fleet that was about to
yeah.
embark to
And
Scotland.
that's the sort of thing that Edward
And
the Fourth would want him to be doing at that age. He was
mm,
getting towards an age where he understood what was going on, where he could begin to see what responsibilities he would have as king. And so it was important to involve him. So it's not as if he was not
yeah,
involved in matters of state.
and he would have need to have
Yes.
been seen as well. Yes, he was still young, and Edward IV had many years on the throne ahead of him. Um, or they believed, but he needed his
Yeah.
son and heir to be seen by his soldiers, by his people, so that because it's that continuity, it
Yeah.
ensures stability that you've got this continuity with the crown.
And aside from anything else, in that day, there's no social media, there's no television, there's no newspapers. Nobody would have a clue what he even looked like. The only occasions that anybody would have seen him were exactly those sort of
Mm.
occasions, state occasions.
So you had another one where he was due to visit Canterbury in 1483, but they had to with his mum. Rather than
Yeah.
with the king. That one was with the queen, but it had to be cancelled because of an outbreak of measles in the city. So that's
Mm,
showing, yes, he was going to be seen, and I'm sure he was going to visit the shrine of St. Thomas Becket.
yeah. Yeah.
But he's the son and heir. They've got measles in the
Yeah.
city. If there was an outbreak, it was virulent and unstoppable. So you're going to prevent the
Yeah.
future king from going anywhere near
Yeah.
it. But what I thought was interesting is something that
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever seen it discussed is that there were marriage negotiations going on all the time. Edward's at Ludlow. Edward IV was trying to find him a
Yeah.
bride. And
Yeah.
one was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, which is quite interesting because one daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella married Henry VIII, but an older daughter, Isabella, was a candidate for Edward V.
Yeah.
And then there's the daughter of the Duke of Milan, Anne of Brittany. I remember writing about this when I was writing Anne's story. And that would have really, really put the cat among the pigeons in France.
Well, Anne of Brittany was one of the most desirable heiresses in Europe,
Oh,
wasn't she?
yes.
Because the Duke of Brittany had no sons.
No, it was just Anne. And Brittany and England had a very long relationship.
Yeah,
I mean, the Dukes of Brittany were also the Earls of Richmond for a long
yeah.
time. So it was like if Edward had married Anne of Brittany, that would have meant he had a chunk of France to himself as well as England. The Hundred Years' War could have been 200 Years' War.
I think Louis the XI of France might have moved heaven and earth to prevent that happening, mind you.
Yeah. Yes, well, actually, it was Louis the XI's daughter, Anne de Beaujeu, who actually arranged Anne of
Yeah,
Brittany's marriage to her brother. She was the most desirable girl
yeah.
in Europe because she had Brittany. So it was interesting to see how what might have happened if Edward V had married Anne of Brittany.
Yeah, I mean, at least, we do know that these provisions were being discussed, that he wasn't sort of out there on his own, and no contact was being made with him by the rest of the royal family and
Mm,
so on. It's ridiculous. But these are the things that people say without knowing anything about it, really.
yeah, and you can imagine a constant stream of letters between the court and
Yeah.
Ludlow. Oh, Edward wants to do this. Edward wants to go fishing tomorrow. Will you let him in a couple of days? Will you let him? Yes, we'll let him. Tell him to wear his jumper. It would have been.
Yeah, I don't think those sort of decisions were sent to the king and queen. I think Rivers would be and Alcock and Vaughan would be making those sort of decisions.
Oh, yeah, but they would have tried to done regular communications just to keep the king and queen in the loop and let them know how he's
The new
progressing.
ordinances said that if the prince didn't stick to the rules, they were to notify the king and queen as soon as possible. So it was written into the new ordinances that,
Mm.
send a letter home, basically, if he's not behaving himself. I think that's delightful.
Yeah,
So there would have been contact. Yeah.
yeah. So, and it's a
Yeah.
great one for Edward, isn't it? Behave
Yeah.
or I'm telling your mum.
Yeah.
And if
Yeah.
that doesn't work, I'm telling your dad.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we see him as this isolated child away from family, although he's actually surrounded by family. No, not his
Yeah.
parents, but siblings, uncles. He would have also had sons of nobles with him,
Yes, I
wouldn't
think he
he?
would.
He'd have had
Yes.
a little household of young noblemen around the same age to be raised with him as companions.
Yeah, we haven't really got any details about that, but it's highly likely, I think, that that would be the case. It was normal for a prince to rub
Mm,
shoulders with with the sons of other great houses. But we don't know. I don't think we know for certain that happened. It's likely to have happened, but we don't know who it might have been.
mm,
Who knows? There are people like Thomas Stanley's sons, the Earl of Northumberland.
mm,
There are some good candidates that Edward the Fourth might well have wanted to sort of enhance his relationship with. So by putting their sons with his son, that kind of gives them a reason to support the
mm.
next king, as it were. It's building bridges with the
Yeah.
nobility, but they really get quite that far because he's only 12.
Mm.
That would become more of a thing in the next few years, probably, than it had done so far.
So now we get to the big question.
Yeah, so
Why didn't he become the king?
well, I guess technically he's regarded as king because we call him Edward the Fifth. And when Edward the Fourth died in April 1483, I don't think there's a single
Mm,
person anywhere who was saying, well, I don't think he should be king. I think it was just generally taken for granted that Edward would become Edward the Fifth, that there was absolutely no doubt whatsoever about that. That's also quite important to remember. The most important reason
mm,
why everything goes wrong is that Edward IV dies suddenly, and nobody is prepared for that. There are people these days who peddle things like, oh, he was poisoned by the Woodvilles. I mean, this is just nonsense. The Woodvilles were at their strongest with Edward IV alive.
yeah,
Why
exactly.
risk everything by killing him? It's ludicrous.
And if you were going to kill him, you'd wait until the son and heir was 18
Well, the whole
or 2021. It's like, why do it when he's the most vulnerable?
the whole
Yeah.
thing though is just nonsense. It's just nonsense. Like most of the things written about the Woodvilles in 1483. I mean, the analogy I always like to give it's a railway network after there's been a week
Mm,
of snow. Everything's in the wrong place. So Edward dies. Now, in the normal way of things, the heir would be in London because he'd know that his father had been ill and may well die. So the heir would be there. The council would be primed that something could well happen in the near future and they needed to be organized for
mm,
that. It would all have been cut and dried. But because Edward died suddenly, Gloucester was in the north, so the man who might well have been protector, the heir himself was in
yeah.
Ludlow. Um, Everything was in the wrong place. And the council had the authority to act until the next king was crowned. So they were charged with the thorny issue of trying to thrash out how the coronation would take place and who would be in charge until then, and so on and so forth. And basically, the council
Mm,
was divided. They weren't divided over whether Edward V should be
yes.
king. They were divided over who should be in charge in the meantime till he came of age. And the division was basically between the Queen, who wanted to be declared regent, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, and the King's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who some thought
Mm,
should be named Protector as the senior surviving Yorkist
yeah.
man of the king's blood, and that he should be Protector and that he was an obvious choice. He was an obvious choice for many because of his reputation up to then,
Mm,
which was, as a loyal supporter of Edward IV. People talk a lot about this division, but at the end of the day, the council had kind of resolved it up to a point. They'd thrashed out how many men Rivers should bring with the king when he came to London and so on, and they'd reduced
mm,
that to 2,000, which was regarded as not too many. So given the fact that the arrangements are being made, the coronation date is set for May the 4th. Now, the date of coronation is quite important because if you're Elizabeth Woodville, you want the coronation as soon as possible. You want him to be crowned, so he's officially anointed by God, he's king, and therefore her influence as his mother is likely to be greater. That's the theory. That's her theory, apart from anybody else. If you're someone like Gloucester who is still in the north and caught on the hop and not quite sure what to do, then
mm.
you want as much delay as possible so that you've got time to sort of get your ducks in a row, try and sort out what you're doing and get down there and start to talk to people. So the coronation date they agreed was the 4th of May, which is pretty soon. Edward died, what, 9th of April? Less than a month.
Yeah, but we say that's pretty soon. But in medieval times, that was actually quite normal. A long delay. It was actually
Yeah,
long.
yeah, it was quite normal if the heir was there.
Yeah, and it was actually a long time for some because, like you say, if the heir was there, then some people were crowned a week,
Yeah,
2 weeks
yeah,
after the death of the king. It wasn't
absolutely.
this, it wasn't this year-long planning that we had with King Charles III. It
Yeah.
was get everybody you can to London who can get there in time and get the crown on the head of the next king.
Absolutely. And that's why we come back to what I said earlier about the whole idea of him being at Ludlow was a very sensible idea. Nobody realized that it would become a not very sensible idea
Mm,
if the king died suddenly, because, he had to be brought to London. There was a
yeah.
vacuum of power in London,
Mm.
which was always dangerous.
We need to address just briefly the idea of Elizabeth Woodville being regent, and the reason she wasn't made regent is England itself didn't have a tradition of Queen Mothers being regent. In France, it was quite normal
Yeah,
that if,
yeah,
although the French didn't allow female succession, they did allow female regencies, and they were quite used to it. England didn't. I mean,
yeah.
they balked at the idea of Margaret of Anjou taking the regency when Henry VI
Yes,
was
yeah,
ill. The only one who technically had it was Isabella of France when Edward II was deposed. But even then, you read a lot of the
mm,
time it's Mortimer who's named the regent
yeah,
rather than Isabella.
yeah,
So the idea of
yeah,
Elizabeth Woodville, it wasn't just that people didn't like the Woodvilles, it was that female regency in England was not popular as an idea in itself. So they would have been looking to the
yeah,
next nearest male adult relative,
exactly.
which would have been technically Richard of Gloucester.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, he was the obvious choice. He was the obvious choice in lots of ways.
Mm,
And in London, you've got this great big powder keg, and the spark is Hastings,
mm,
because Hastings is in a bit of a panic, really. He's one of those on the council who support the Duke of Gloucester becoming protector. It's always said that Hastings did not get on with the Queen. I think that's highly likely, but it doesn't mean that he was her enemy as such. The
no.
problem with the Woodvilles, as far as Hastings was concerned, was not the Queen, but her eldest son, Thomas Grey, who was Marquis of Dorset. And there was definite, of all the things that are said about the Woodvilles and all the rest of it, the only feud which is known to have been taking place was between William Hastings and Thomas Grey, Marquis of Dorset.
Mm,
And it's quite possible that Elizabeth Woodville supported her son, Thomas Grey. There's no reason to doubt that. And therefore, in Hastings' eyes, Thomas Grey, who in 1483 had the Tower of London, he was in charge of the Tower of London, Thomas Grey was a potential problem for him personally as
Mm.
much as anything else. And the way I see it, as far as Dorset was concerned, William Hastings was many things, but one of the things he was yesterday's man.
Mm.
Now that Edward IV was dead, it was a whole new political ball game. Yes, William Hastings had been a trusted advisor and friend of Edward IV, but that was gone. That was old news. Now new men, and this is a constant of politics. New
Mm.
men now needed to take up the role, and so as far as Dorset was concerned, Hastings was someone who
Mm.
wasn't of any consequence. Now, if you're Hastings, you are panicking a bit because you think, well, the young prince is going to be brought here by 2,000 men, by his uncle Earl Rivers, and Thomas Grey has the Tower, and Elizabeth Woodville is pushing to be made regent. So, in Hastings' eyes, Gloucester's position is weak.
Mm.
And so he writes to the Duke of Gloucester and says, get down here quick, because if you don't, it may be too late. You may be outmaneuvered by a combination of the Woodville people in power. And so Gloucester gets that letter, and no doubt Gloucester has already been making plans to come south, but because the coronation is on the May the 4th. So he hurries up, basically,
Mm.
and he comes down as fast as he can. And at some point, he meets the Duke of Buckingham, though nobody's really sure whether he meets him on the way or whether he meets
Mm.
him just before he meets Earl Rivers. But Gloucester is on his way, and he's armed with this letter, which suggests that there might be a problem. For Hastings, there might well be a problem. It doesn't mean that there might be a problem for Gloucester,
Mm.
but it's a possibility.
So it's Hastings who's looking for an ally to offset the power of the Woodvilles
Yeah,
because
and
he thinks he's going to be pushed out.
amongst all of Edward IV's loyal lords, let's say, the most influential, Hastings has got few lands, or not few lands, but he hasn't got as much wealth and power as, say,
Mm.
Thomas Stanley, the Earl of Northumberland, or Rivers himself, or Gloucester. He hasn't got that kind of clout. His importance lies in being the king's chamberlain,
Mm.
but the king's dead. So you can see why Hastings
Yeah.
is feeling a bit nervous. Now, Hastings actually is also captain of Calais, which has the only standing army in England. Not that it's in England, it's in Calais, but
Mm.
he's captain of Calais, and he actually threatens, if they don't reduce the size of Rivers' retinue to bring the new king to London, he threatens to go to Calais and bring back his 15,000 strong troops. You know, there is an element of
Mm.
crisis as far as Hastings is concerned. But what Hastings is not telling Gloucester to do is to come south and take the throne. That's the last thing on his mind. He's just thinking of
Mm.
control of the new king, those around the new king. He's not thinking about the new king
Yeah.
not being king. It never crosses his mind. So that's where the whole ball gets rolling, really. There's a lot of nonsense talked about relationship between Gloucester and Rivers. Absolutely no evidence to suggest they didn't get on. Even sort of months before this, Rivers is asking Gloucester to intervene in a dispute in which he's involved. Well, you don't do that with somebody you don't trust or worried about. And also he goes to meet Richard and Buckingham on the way to London, and he takes a very small
Mm.
number of men with him. Well, if Richard of Gloucester is somebody that you're worried about, that you're fearful of, that you suspect in any way of intrigue or plotting, A, you are not going to go and meet him, and B, you are definitely not going to go and meet him with hardly any men. He didn't
Yeah.
suspect anything at all when he went to meet Buckingham and Gloucester. But the upshot was he was arrested. So that's one side of it. The other thing we need to address is this whole Woodville conspiracy thing that Hastings is fueled the flames of by writing to
Mm,
Gloucester and saying, watch out for the Queen and
mm,
Dorset and so on. But there is zero evidence at all of any Woodville plot from beginning to end of this whole crisis. And it makes me laugh when people say, oh, well, you've got Rivers with these 2,000 men, you've got the Queen, you've got Dorset's in charge of the Tower, you've got Edward Woodville, who is in control of the fleet. They are basically in control of everything.
mm.
They are in control of nothing,
Yeah.
basically, because if Rivers was going to stage a coup, he would get to London as fast as he could. But he waits ages before he even leaves Ludlow. He's in absolutely no hurry at all. No, it's a nonsense. And as soon as Rivers is arrested, again, the chances of a York
Mm.
of a Woodville plot are zero. The Queen goes into sanctuary. She's got no men. She's got no arms or any means of plotting. Dorset flees because that's Dorset. Dorset is the flakiest individual apart from the Duke of Clarence or the Duke of Buckingham. There's a lot of candidates to be the flakiest in 1483. But
Maybe that's an episode for later. Who's the flakiest?
the flakiest member of the Yorkist family. Yeah. So who's
Mm,
going to plot? There's nobody to plot. Edward Woodville, this is another classic. He's with the fleet.
yeah.
He's at sea. He doesn't even know that Edward the Fourth is
Mm.
dead when all this is going on. So it's just ludicrous, but it's peddled time
Yeah,
after
but
time.
didn't he flee with the
Sorry?
treasury? Didn't he steal
Who?
the treasury? Edward Woodville. Didn't he steal the treasury when he put to sea as soon as Edward was dead with all of
No,
England's money?
he didn't.
I'm sure I read that somewhere.
I'm sure you did read it somewhere, but it just didn't. And anyway, why would he put to sea with all the money
When he
when
wants his
when his
nephew
sister?
crowned.
Yeah, oh, it's just yeah. But it's
Mm,
laughable, but unfortunately, if you repeat something often enough, people believe it to be the case and will argue about it
yes.
till the cows come home.
I mean, so the thing is, after Stony Stratford, Anthony Woodville's been arrested. So has the King's half-brother Richard
Yes.
Grey and what was Thomas
Well,
Vaughan?
Thomas Vaughan was his chamberlain, but he wasn't arrested just yet.
Oh, right. So
That
Vaughan
he
was still
didn't go.
loose.
Well, Vaughan was with Edward the
The
Fifth
King.
because that's where he should be, because he was his chamberlain. But when Richard and Buckingham arrived where the young prince was, he immediately arrested Thomas Vaughan, who's in his
Mm,
70s, so clearly a major threat. And we know from the evidence that Edward protested about that. This is not some milksop who's going to be pushed around. And he protested about the arrest of Rivers and Grey. Well, why wouldn't he
mm,
protest about it? These were the people who had been with him since he was 3 years old. So,
yeah.
he doesn't, but he doesn't lie down quietly, and that is really a very important point because for Richard's own reasons, everybody thinks, well, Richard was very, very powerful in the north. He was unassailable, really. Well, he wasn't because a lot of his lands were in the gift of the king. The king was dead. There was a new king.
Mm,
Also, a lot of his lands were Neville lands that he'd been given. But other members of the Neville family could claim those lands if somebody else in the Neville family, i.e., George Neville, died.
mm,
And on the 4th of May, 1483, George Neville died, which meant there was a kind of open season on Neville lands that Richard held. So he was very worried that if he couldn't control Edward V, he could actually lose masses of his lands, not just a few,
mm,
but he could be reduced to a very, very unimportant landholder. Now, some of those lands he would keep till he died, but they wouldn't get passed on to his son, who at that time was still alive. But so Richard was worried, and it seems to me that his first encounter with Edward V probably convinced him that he was going to find it quite difficult to control this new king. And that, I think, is a critical point, because I often ask the question of people, well, if Edward was such a weak individual, why did Richard bother taking the throne at all? Because if this young prince was such a milksop, why didn't Richard just say, well, he could be king and I'll just make sure that he does everything I want him to?
Yeah.
Well, clearly he couldn't do that. And I think he realized that fairly quickly. And that's where the next stages went.
And we have to explain also that although there is precedence in that there had been minorities before, there was no actual hard and fast rule when a king was old enough to rule personally.
Yeah.
It was basically left up to the boy to declare his majority. Yeah. So Edward at this time was 12, was soon to turn 13. And 13 was one of those ages where there had been Malcolm IV in Scotland was 13 when he became king, and he ruled personally from that moment. So there were precedents. Edward III was when he was 18. Henry III declared his majority when he was about 21, but then carried on letting somebody else rule until he was about 25. So there was no hard and fast rule. So Richard wouldn't know whether or not Edward V was going to turn around at the age of 13 and say, right, I'm king now and I'm taking control, or whether he'd wait until he was 21. So there was
or 15. 15 was another age it was possible.
That added to the uncertainty of what the future held.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Richard, he had no way of knowing, but he had to do what he thought was best for him and his family at that time.
I'm loath to address it, but I think I should address the whole issue of, could Richard possibly have done all these horrible things that he's accused of? If we look at what Richard did before all this, he was, as we know, immensely loyal to his brother. He was also, it has to be said, a man who sought justice, not just for his own followers, but sometimes even when it was against one of his own followers. So he had a reputation for justice and a reputation for loyalty, which was well deserved. But where his own personal interests were involved, he was very ruthless indeed. He had been ruthless in the dispute with his brother George, Duke of Clarence, over the Neville inheritance. He had been ruthless with in other aspects where his own rights were being questioned or debated. So what he does in 1483 for me is totally consistent with the character of Richard as has been displayed all his life. He believes in justice, but there's a line that he draws where his own matters are concerned, where he says, well, I will break the law if necessary to protect my own interests. He's not alone in that, but I think once he arrests Rivers for absolutely no reason at all, no legal justification, that's the first of the dominoes, really. Once he does that, for me, I don't see how he gets out of all the other things that he does. I just can't see that he has any. It just all leads him there. It's back of an envelope stuff, really. He doesn't come down planning it.
Especially after he meets Edward and Edward stands up for Rivers and Vaughan. It's like, what do I do now? You know, because...
Yeah, because what it means is that somebody's going to be asking questions, not least the king, but somebody's going to be asking the question, okay, well, let's have a trial of Rivers and Grey and so on. And, we'll hear the evidence. Well, of course, there isn't any evidence. That's why Rivers and co are sent north to one of Richard's strongholds. And so eventually they are summarily executed. The only evidence presented at the time were a couple of wagons of old weapons, which were brought to London as evidence that this is what, that they'd been stockpiling weapons. Well, I don't think anybody at the time was fooled by that, and we shouldn't be either. I mean, it's just, window dressing. One of the first things Richard does when he gets to London with the king, the new king, is he postpones the coronation now till the 22nd of June. Now, a lot of the councillors are probably saying, well, that's a very sensible idea because we haven't really got time to get
Mm,
everything. If people will be coming in, lords will be coming in to attend it and so on. We've got too little time. So very sensible to postpone it till the 22nd of June. But it also then gives Richard time to get himself
mm,
in charge, as it were, which he is. He's in charge. So anybody who says somebody else is responsible for anything
yeah.
that happens, he's in charge. And he's not an idiot. He's not as if somebody's going to wrap him round their finger and persuade him to do something he doesn't want to do. But what we see is this ongoing decline where as each step is taken, he gets himself into a position where he has fewer and fewer options. And it starts, as I said, with the rest of Rivers. But in the middle of June, something really bizarre happens, and that's the execution of Hastings. Now, William Hastings is the one that
Mm,
warned Richard about a possibility that some of the Woodvilles could stop him being protector. And so you would reckon that of all Richard's allies at court,
mm,
Hastings is the staunch one. He's the one that got most to gain by supporting Richard. So why on earth would he be dragged out of a council meeting, taken onto the green outside, and have his head lopped
yeah.
off suddenly, brutally? It beggared belief at the time. People just could not get their heads around it. What on earth is going on? It just didn't make any sense to anybody. So if it didn't make any sense at the time, it's quite hard in 600 years later or whatever to try and work out what was
Mm,
going on. What was he accused of? He was accused of plotting with the Queen, plotting with the Woodvilles. That was the justification for his execution at that moment. Now, when you think about it, Rivers is locked up, Grey's locked up, the Queen's in sanctuary, Dorset's fled. Who was he plotting with?
yeah.
Nobody's got any resources to plot. The real reason that Hastings is executed is clearly not that he was plotting against Richard, because he wasn't. He
Mm,
wouldn't have gone to the council meeting unsuspecting if he thought that there was any chance that Richard might act against him, and certainly not if he was plotting against Richard. That would have been a stupid thing to do, and he wasn't stupid. So this was totally unexpected to Hastings. So if it was unexpected to Hastings, why would Richard need to
mm,
execute Hastings? Not just execute him, but execute him immediately. And they're two separate things, really. Why did he act against Hastings? And why did Hastings have to go straight away? And I only have one answer to that, and I don't think anybody's suggested any answer which I can believe other than that. And he must
mm,
have been sounded out about Richard taking the throne. That's the only thing I can think of, because we know that the Woodvilles probably weren't plotting against Richard in the first place, but even if they were, they certainly weren't by the 13th of June, because they were all unable to do so.
yeah. None of them were in a
So,
position to do anything.
yeah. So the idea that Hastings, having a feud with the Marquis of Dorset, would be joining them all in some plot is very unlikely. But the only thing that makes it possible to even consider is that Richard, either directly or indirectly through Buckingham or Catesby or somebody else, had been sounding Hastings out about, well, what if the young prince was maybe illegitimate, and perhaps I need to step in as a sort of adult to rule the country effectively. That's the only thing I can think of, that he'd been sounded out and had shown that this was something he was not going to contemplate. And therefore,
Mm,
having been sounded out, he had to be executed because he'd been found wanting. He had to be executed, and executed before he could talk to anybody about it.
yeah, before anyone knew
Because he wouldn't have been
what
talking to
was the
anybody
full.
about it up to that point, because he came to the council. He was one
Mm,
of the councillors. He was unsuspecting, but he couldn't be allowed to live in case he decided to talk to somebody else about it. And Richard wasn't ready to do anything at that
yeah.
point. He'd sent letters north 2 days earlier to ask for more troops in case, there's again the Woodville plot that never was. By the time he's asking for more troops, he's already in charge anyway, but never mind. So yeah, so this is a shocking event. This is totally shocking. He also arrests Lord Stanley, but he soon lets him go because he realizes that Stanley is a whole different ball game to Hastings. Stanley has a power base in the
This is,
northwest. If he acts against
yes.
Stanley, he's going to lose that power base. So he lets him go.
Mm,
But it's a very, very shocking act to everybody at court. And remember, the other thing is there's a lot of people at court. People have come for the coronation. So there's more lords and knights and gentry in London than there would normally be.
mm,
So this event is big news with those people in London. If the most loyal servant of Edward IV and ally of the Duke can have his head chopped off in a council meeting, who is safe, basically?
yeah. And I suppose for Richard, it shows everybody how far he's going to go. So fewer people, whatever moves he makes next, fewer people are going to oppose it.
Yeah, you can see how Hastings might have been sounded out. You can see that somebody would say, well,
Mm,
you were right to point out the Woodville threat. You were right to warn us about that. But I think the only way we can really counter that is not to make young Edward king. You can see the logic they would have tried to use, but it wasn't going
mm,
to work because, I mean, people have poo-pooed this. I've read it in various places, but William Hastings was Edward IV's oldest friend.
yeah.
I just can't countenance that he would have said, "Oh yeah, okay, let's not make the son of my great friend
Mm,
king. Let's just, sideline him." I just don't see that he
mm.
would have gone with that.
One of the arguments you see all over when they talk about Richard III taking the throne from Edward V, Richard had to take the throne because England under a minority king was always a problem. Woe unto the country whose king is a
Yeah.
child. But he wasn't a child. He was 12 years old and he obviously had a mind of his own already.
Yes.
If you've got good people in place to help him and guide him to help him rule, it's not actually going to be a problem. When you look at the previous minorities, the most stable period of Henry VI's reign was actually when he was a child and other people were
Yes.
ruling for him. Same with
Absolutely.
Richard II.
Yeah. Well, let's deal with the whole illegitimacy thing because it's the biggest red herring in history, really.
Mm,
Let's just assume, for argument's sake, that Bishop Stillington was telling the truth. There was a pre-contract to marry Eleanor Butler, and therefore, in canon law, any children between Edward and Elizabeth Woodville were illegitimate. Let's just assume that is true. What should have happened in June, July 1483 is a church court should have been convened
yes.
to judge the case and decide whether or not the princes were legitimate or illegitimate. But even if that church court said, yes, they're illegitimate, it didn't mean Edward wouldn't be king. All Parliament had to do was pass a law saying that Edward V was the rightful heir and he would be anointed as king. And at that point, his illegitimacy was irrelevant. So
Mm,
if Uncle Richard had wanted to support his nephew, that is what he would have done. That's how you went about it. So if Richard didn't do that, if he instead used it as a reason to become king, then it is clearly just a bit of window dressing. It's just an excuse. And so whether or not he was illegitimate doesn't mean he
mm,
can't be king. That's something that everybody seems to think that's the case. Oh, he's illegitimate, he can't be king. Rubbish.
mm.
It's just not true.
Yeah. The fact that Richard first tried it with Edward IV, trying to declare him illegitimate first, suggests that he was trying to find a way to keep Edward V from the
Yeah,
throne.
just casually trashing the reputation of his still living mother, Cecily Neville.
Yeah. And that's the thing. She was still
Yeah.
alive. She could speak up against it. So,
And since, as we said right at the start, when Edward IV died, nobody is saying Edward V shouldn't be king. He was generally accepted as going to be king. So, unless there was some other reason why he
mm,
shouldn't be king, then even the fact that he was illegitimate, because he was quite obviously the son of the previous king,
Mm.
he should have been king.
He wouldn't necessarily have been declared illegitimate by a church court.
No,
If Elizabeth Woodville had married Edward IV in good faith and they could prove that she had no idea that he'd had a previous marriage, then they could declare the children of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville legitimate because she believed they were legitimate.
the other thing is that, of course, they were going to call a parliament, but Richard put an end to that. And if they had called a parliament, there would have been a mechanism in place to declare Edward V as the legitimate heir anyway. But without a parliament in place, that was impossible. So
Mm,
he'd kind of, I think, anybody who really believes that he didn't engineer this is deluding themselves, to be honest. Doesn't make him a monster, but he was
mm,
politically he was engineering a coup. It's a coup. That's what it is. Simple as that. I come back to something we talked about earlier. The coup would not have happened. There would have been no need for it if young Edward V was malleable. But because he showed from the start,
mm,
and it's possible Richard had sort of seen glimpses of this in the past when he'd come across him, but certainly not only was Edward V someone who had a mind of his own, but Richard's immediate actions on arresting his other uncle, Rivers, his half brother, and so on, had already put a wall between him and his nephew. So not only was Edward going to be difficult to manage,
mm.
but also you've started off on the wrong foot because you've arrested his closest advisors. So you've really blown it, to be honest.
Yeah.
As a lesson in trying
Mm,
to sort of manage a kingdom in a minority, it's not a very good one. Because if Richard had come down, met with Rivers, amicable discussion, which there was, far as we're aware, accompanied the young king to London, been Lord Protector, chatted to the king, got on with him, things would have been a lot easier. But he didn't do that. And as I said, that's why I always say the arrest of Rivers was the first
mm.
thing after which there was no going back because he'd alienated Edward V.
So, should we ask the question, would he have made a good king?
There's so many variables, though, aren't there, really? I mean,
Mm,
a good king in isolation is one thing, but you never know what crises a king will have to deal with, wars and so on. So it's rather hard to make any judgment on the evidence of his first 12 years. He obviously had a mind of his own, he was well educated. There's no reason to suppose he didn't get on with people quite well. Um, but the evidence is so thin that it's very
mm.
difficult. I mean, his personality was obviously strong, but was that a good thing or a bad thing? Would that mean he wouldn't get on with people, or was he like Edward IV who got on with everybody, male and female?
Yeah. I suppose all we can say is that the ordinances that were drawn up to oversee his education suggest that he was given all the
Yeah,
tools to be a good king.
absolutely. I think he was the best prepared
Yeah.
Prince of Wales there'd ever been.
Mm,
So he should have been successful.
mm.
But as we know from the previous couple of hundred years of history, should be successful doesn't mean you are.
Yeah. And also, as we know from Henry VIII, who was also, after his brother's death, he was what, 10 or 11 when his brother died, and 18 when he became king. So for those 8 years, he was trained to be king, and he was, you could say, a strong king, but he definitely had some very big flaws, um, which,
Well, one of which was that he was a monster.
yeah.
But apart from that, well, it's an interesting comparison, actually, because if you compare the early upbringing of Prince Henry was with his sisters and a very relaxed, laid back, he was, pampered and all the rest of it. It's only when his brother died that his upbringing changed.
Mm,
And I think it was a bit late to change him as an
mm,
individual. And whereas you compare that with Prince Edward, he was brought up in what some might describe as quite an austere,
yeah.
um, very firm household from the age of 3. So
Mm,
It was in everything he learned there was instilled in him. Henry VIII didn't have that, and it's a shame because he really could have done with it.
Mhm. So I guess the last question is, given the recent talk of the Pretenders and whether or not the, what was it, the Edward V was at the Battle of Stoke.
I think that's been rubbished quite clearly. I mean, I don't think Lambert Simnel
Yeah,
was, I mean, I don't think anybody really believes that he was Edward V.
there was a plot in July 1483 to free them from the tower. So they were obviously still a threat.
Well, the thing is we have to be careful with this. There was an attempt to free them, but the people attempting to free them didn't necessarily know whether they were still alive or not. There's no evidence
Mm,
that they knew they were alive because their own servants had already been dismissed. So there's nobody necessarily that we know of, there could have been, but there's nobody we
mm,
know of who could have confirmed they were still alive at the end of July. So sometime between the coronation of Richard, probably, and September, they disappeared. We don't know exactly when.
mm,
I always go back to Elizabeth Woodville, and Elizabeth Woodville throws her support behind Henry Tudor
mm.
and aims to marry her daughter Elizabeth to Henry Tudor. Is there any chance in the world that she would do that if she thought there was any chance that either of her two sons was still alive? I just don't see it. I think she must have known by that point that they must be dead.
Yeah,
And if they weren't
no.
dead, all Richard had to do was say, "Well, here they are." His silence is deafening, as they say. So I think
Mm,
they were dead. Personally, I think they were already dead by September at the latest.
yeah,
And heresy to say it, I don't think it matters much because Richard, for me, Richard had done enough to justify being condemned, whether he killed his nephews or not. Is it worse to kill his nephews than hack the head off William Hastings? If it's worse, it's only marginally worse. So yeah, I just think it's
mm,
all these things are designed to deflect blame from Richard of Gloucester, and I think he has to take that blame really. Tragic figure, Edward V, really. Very tragic figure. I think a prince of great promise who was swept away really
mm,
not because he lacked promise, not because he did anything which was stupid or hostile to anybody.
yeah.
He didn't do anything which would justify him not being king. That's for me the tragedy of it.
He might have been England's greatest king. We will never know. And that's the shame of it.
I think he'd have been a much better king than Henry Tudor. Heresy to say that for all you Tudor lovers out there, but
We've rubbished Richard III. We might as well rubbish the Tudors as well.
yeah, my money's on Edward V. He'd have been a great king.
He is definitely one of those what would have beens in history, and it's a shame that he didn't get the chance to be anything other than one of the princes in the tower. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for listening. I hope some of that made sense.
We've done our best.
Do join us next time when we will be joined by Sarah Cockrell to discuss Eleanor of Castile. I'm looking forward to that. It's I've read Sarah's book on Eleanor and it's fascinating. So I'm looking forward to getting into the nitty-gritty of Eleanor of Castile. I've been Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. You may already know that our podcasts are to be found on both your favourite podcast provider and also on YouTube. So, not a bad idea to subscribe if you want to make sure you don't miss one. And if you do have a minute and you've enjoyed the podcast, we'd really welcome you giving us a review or just some feedback in a comment. Thanks for listening.